don't know, Gus, I've always thought that my ego has never caused me any trouble, but maybe I'm much more troubled than I think. Maybe egos come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. Whatever the case, I look at what I have to do, and the older I get, the more I realize I can't do it without God's help. At age 90, Jimmy Swaggart is finally telling the truth about his empire, from secret hotel rooms to million-dollar dolls. Scandals, as the man who used to make $500,000 a day talks about what really... There were hidden cams in Room 7 as part of an angry enemy's revenge plan. America's most famous televangelist tried to hide Jimmy Swaggart's shocking confession that turned everything upside down. He was born on March 15, 1935, in Faraday, Louisiana, a small town with no electricity or paved roads. His father, Willie Leon Son Swaggart, was a Pentecostal preacher and fiddler, and his mother, Minbel Heron, came from a family of sharecroppers. Faith was the center of their lives, and they were part of the Assemblies of God, was a church that believed in spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues. Jimmy's devotion to the church began at a young age. Church was more than just a Sunday tradition. It was a place where people found hope. It was loud, emotional, and full of music. Jimmy's mother sang in the choir, and his father played the fiddle during worship. Music was in his blood, but so was rebellion. As a teenager, he gambled and played pool, but he wouldn't use his musical talent outside of church because he thought it was only for God. When he was only 8, he said he felt like in the 1,950 yes, he made only $30 a week as a preacher, which wasn't even enough to support his wife and son. They often stayed in church basements or with other pastors because they didn't have their own home. During all of this, Frances Anderson was the one person who never left his side. Jimmy married her on October 10, 1952, when he was 17 and she was 15. Her parents didn't want her to get married because they wanted her to finish school and make a better life for herself, but Jimmy was determined to make a life for herself. He reportedly lied about Frances's age on the marriage license, and they started their life together with nothing. After the wedding, they moved in with Jimmy's parents because they didn't have any money. Frances's mother was devastated because she thought her daughter had given up too much, but Frances believed in Jimmy's mission and stood by him through every problem. Jimmy Swaggart began his ministry in the 1,950s with almost nothing. He preached all over rural Louisiana with his wife Frances and their young son Donnie. He worked odd jobs to make $30 a week, which is about $290 today. That wasn't enough to support his family, so they lived in church basements, small motels, and even the homes of pastors who gave them shelter every day. It was hard, but Swaggart wouldn't give up. He preached anywhere people would listen, sometimes in small country churches and sometimes on a flatbed trailer in an open field. Many of the congregations he spoke to could barely afford to give him anything, but he kept going. Frances helped him run their home and support his ministry. Donnie grew up seeing his parents give up everything for their faith. Life was hard, but something about Swaggart's preaching struck a chord with people. His passion, energy, and unwavering belief drew them in. Slowly, his following started to grow. In 1960, he started recording gospel music and airing his sermons on Christian radio. He still lived in poverty, but his voice was reaching more people. The years he spent in prison shaped him into the preacher he would become. They also gave him a deep understanding of struggle that his audiences could relate to. Around the same time, he was offered a way out. Sam Phillips, the famous producer at Sun Records, wanted to sign him as the label's first gospel artist. Phillips had already made stars out of Elvis Presley and Swaggart's cousin Jerry Lee Lewis, who was making $20,000 a week compared to $30 a week for Swaggart. Phillips thought Swaggart could bring gospel music to a wider audience. Swaggart refused to sign the record deal because he believed his true calling was preaching and that signing the deal would take him away from that mission. Walking away meant more years of financial hardship, but he never looked back. Instead, he recorded gospel albums on his own and sold millions of copies through mail orders. He found a way to use music in his ministry without giving up what he believed in. In 1969, he took another leap of faith and began a radio show called Camp Meeting Hour that would change. At first, it was a small business that he mostly ran with his own savings and a few donations. He preached fiery sermons and played gospel music in an effort to reach as many people as possible, but after only a few broadcasts, he ran out of money because airtime was expensive and he didn't have enough to keep the show going. Desperate, he put out an ad on the air asking for help, and within days, 900 letters with $33,000 were sent in. That was enough to keep the program going, and the Camp Meeting Hour started to grow. By the 1,970s, His voice was no longer limited to Louisiana, it was reaching the whole country. Jimmy Swaggart started his television ministry in 1975, and everything changed. His weekly show began on local stations, but it didn't stay small for long. Viewers quickly became hooked on his passionate preaching and gospel music, and by the early 1980s, Swaggart's broadcasts were seen in over 143 countries and translated into many languages. He was able to reach so many people because he mixed fiery sermons with soulful music. By 1983, Swaggart's shows were on more than 250 TV stations across the U.S., and his daily Bible study programs became a routine for millions of viewers. At its peak, his U.S. audience reached 2.1 million households every week, making him one of the most watched religious figures of his time. In the 1980s, improvements in broadcasting technology helped Swaggart grow even more. By the middle of that decade, his shows were not only airing in the U.S., but also in Africa, Asia, and South America. His influence went far beyond religion. He became a key figure in the Christian right movement and even met President Ronald Reagan. But with such huge success came problems. As the years went on, controversy threatened to destroy everything he had built at the height of his fame. By 1987, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries was making an amazing $150 million a year, which is more than $500,000 every working day. This huge amount of money came from donations from viewers and sales of gospel records, books, and other items. His organization even ran one of the biggest mail-order businesses in Louisiana. Swaggart's headquarters in Baton Rouge showed how much money was coming in. His ministry ran from a huge campus that included the Family Worship Center, a 7,000-seat megachurch, and a Zoe Vance teleproduction center, which was built with a $7 million gift from a wealthy donor, was one of the most expensive additions. These high-end studios let Swaggart produce TV shows at a level that few others in religious broadcasting could match. The money also paid for a fancy lifestyle that Swaggart and his family lived in a $1.5 million mansion on a 20-acre estate with a swimming pool and gold-plated fixtures. He flew in a private Gulfstream jet and drove matching luxury cars with his wife. Even though he ran a nonprofit ministry, Swaggart kept financial information secret by calling his organization a church, which meant it wasn't required to release financial information to the public. Critics questioned the secrecy, but millions of followers still gave. Their loyalty would be put to the test when scandals brought the ministry into crisis, which was one of the clearest signs of Swaggart's elitism. It had its own postal code because of the huge amount of mail his ministry got. At its peak, over 1 million letters a month. These letters weren't just fan mail. They included prayer requests, personal stories, and most importantly, donations. To handle the constant flood of mail, Swaggart's headquarters hired thousands of people, making it one of Baton Rouge's biggest employers. The letters also served as a powerful form of communication. They were a fundraising tool that helped the ministry keep track of who was watching and donating, making sure that the money kept coming in. Swaggart's influence went far beyond TV. He sold millions of gospel albums and videotapes, spreading his message through music and home recordings. His monthly magazine, The Evangelist, kept followers interested even when they weren't watching his broadcasts. All of the platforms he used helped him grow his influence, making him one of the most powerful figures in televangelism. He wasn't a quiet preacher. His sermons were firestorms full of passion, urgency, and warnings of judgment. In the 1980s, he had over 2.1 million weekly viewers in the U.S., making him one of the most influential televangelists of his time. His preaching wasn't about gently persuading people, it was about waking them up. He painted vivid pictures of heaven and hell and called his audience to repentance with such intensity that it made them shout, cry, or drop to their knees in shock. Pray for Swaggart. The battle wasn't just spiritual. He saw that America was moving away from its Christian roots and took it upon himself to call out the forces he thought were to blame. He preached against secularism, liberalism, and what he saw as the moral decline of society. He spoke out against abortion, homosexuality, pornography, and feminism, saying that they were destroying the family. That wasn't all. He also attacked modern psychology, calling it one of Satan's greatest tools. He thought that self-help and therapy there was a time when televangelism replaced faith in many churches, but not everyone agreed with that view. Some said he relied too much on emotion and not enough on deep theological teaching, saying that it was easy to make people angry, but true faith needed more than fiery sermons. Then there were the scandals. Jimmy Swaggart's 1988 scandal was one of the most dramatic events in the history of televangelism. At the time, he was one of the most famous preachers in America. Millions of people watched his TV sermons, and his ministry made about $140 million a year. But behind the scenes, a nasty feud was about to bring everything down. In 1986, Swaggart accused fellow Assemblies of God minister Marvin Gorman of having extramarital affairs. The accusations hurt Gorman's reputation, cost him his ministerial credentials, and shut down his ministry. Gorman was humiliated, but he didn't want to give up. He spent the next 2 years planning how to get even. By 1988, Gorman and his wife Swaggart was known to visit prostitutes, so his family set a trap for him with a camera hidden behind a black cloth. On February 16, Gorman's son Randy and son-in-law Garland Bilbo spied on the Travel Motel on Airline Highway in New Orleans, which was a known hotspot for prostitution. They got exactly what they wanted. Swaggart was caught on camera entering room 7 with Deborah Murphy, a local prostitute. At first, Gorman gave Swaggart information that proved it, gave Swaggart a chance to make things right by asking for an apology and a public retraction of the accusations that had destroyed his life, but Swaggart refused. Gorman took the evidence directly to the leadership of the Assemblies of God, and within days, church officials confronted Swaggart. The scandal broke quickly, sending shockwaves through Swaggart's ministry. 5 days later, on February 21, 1988, Swaggart stood in front of his congregation and made an emotional confession. Tears ran down his face as he admitted to moral failings, but he refused to change. Millions of people watched, making it one of the most famous moments in the history of televangelism. But Swaggart's tears couldn't undo the damage. The Assemblies of God quickly responded. Church leaders told him to stop preaching for a year and get counseling for 2 years. The goal was to rebuild trust and give him a way to be forgiven. But Swaggart refused, saying that being out of the public eye for that long would destroy his ministry, his TV empire, and his Bible college. For him, leaving wasn't an option. On April 8, 1988, the Assemblies of God Executive Presbyter held an emergency meeting over an 80-minute phone call. They made their decision. Swaggart would be defrocked, lose his ministerial credentials, and be permanently cut off from the denomination. But before the church could make its announcement, Swaggart quit the Assemblies of God on his own terms. A few weeks later, on May 22, 1988, he returned to the pulpit as an independent preacher. He had previously called for harsh punishments for other ministers who had been killed, but now that he was involved in his own scandal, he refused to accept punishment. His hypocrisy was clear. But that wasn't the only time he did something wrong. On October 11, 1991, Jimmy Swaggart was driving a 1989 Jaguar through Indio, California, when police pulled him over for driving on the wrong side of the road. His car's license plates had expired, and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was given multiple tickets for multiple traffic violations. Rosemary Garcia, a known prostitute, was sitting next to him in the car. Garcia later told reporters what had happened. "He asked me for sex," she said. "That's why he stopped me. That's what I do. I'm a prostitute," according to Garcia. Swaggart freaked out when he saw a police car behind him and quickly tried to hide pornographic magazines before the officers got close. This was a situation that was all too familiar. Swaggart had been caught in a scandal 3 years earlier in 1988. About another prostitute at a motel in New Orleans, he had stood in front of his congregation with tears in his eyes and begged for forgiveness. This time, he didn't do that. Instead, he stood in front of his congregation at the family worship center and said, "The Lord told me, it's flat, none of your business." Later, Swaggart's son Donnie announced that he would be stepping down for a time of healing and counseling, but the damage was already done before his first public apology. Before the first scandal in 1988, Swaggart was one of the most famous televangelists in the world. His sermons were seen by 510 million people in 145 countries, and his ministry made $150 million a year and received an average of $500,000 in donations every day. But after the first scandal, his empire began to fall apart. When the second scandal happened in 1991, major TV networks stopped airing his shows, and his international broadcasts, which were a key part of his ministry, were shut down. The ministry had to sell off production. As a result, Jimmy Swaggart Bible College went from having over 1,000 students at its peak to only 37 students in the early 1000, 990s. Many of his followers, who had forgiven him once, refused to do it again. His refusal to apologize turned more people away, and his finances got worse. In the 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart was one of the biggest televangelists in the world. His ministry made about $150 million a year, mostly from donations and sales of gospel records books. Swaggart had a huge empire that included a 257-acre campus with a Bible college and a state-of-the-art production center. But in 1988, everything started to fall apart when he was caught in a prostitution scandal. Donations stopped right away, TV networks canceled his show, and attendance at his family worship center in Baton Rouge dropped. His ministry, which used to have 1,500 employees and needed $350,000 every day to run, had to shut down, to lay off workers and end projects. By 1991, Swaggart's TV audience had dropped from millions to just 400,000 households. His Bible college lost most of its students and faculty. The empire, which had once been a sign of his success, was now struggling to stay alive. In desperation, Swaggart even started pleading for small donations during his sermons. The money problems raised bigger questions. Since Swaggart's ministry was a church, but it didn't have to give the IRS its financial records. Critics said that a lot of the money was spent on private jets, making TV shows, and aggressive fundraising instead of actual charity. By the mid-1990s, his annual income had dropped to just $1 million, a small fraction of what it had been at its peak. His empire, which had been unstoppable, was now in ruins. Swaggart's downfall wasn't just about money. His legal problems were just as bad. In 1986, he accused fellow televangelist Marvin Gorman of adultery and helped get him kicked out of the Assemblies of God church. The scandal destroyed Gorman's ministry and pushed him out of office. To get back at Swaggart, Gorman sued him for defamation in 1987, saying that the accusations were false or exaggerated. The trial was explosive. Gorman's lawyers showed evidence that Swaggart had used the scandal to get rid of competitors. But the biggest surprise came when Gorman said he had hired a private investigator who later revealed Swaggart's relationship with prostitutes, which helped bring down Swaggart's career in 1991. He was found guilty of defamation and intentionally causing emotional distress against Gorman. The court awarded Gorman $10 million in damages, with $1 million for personal damages and $9 million for his ministry. After appeals, the case was settled in 1994 for $1,850,000, which was a huge financial hit for a ministry that was already having a hard time staying afloat. Jimmy Swaggart's life has been shaped by faith, family, and controversy. He was born on March 15, 1935, in Faraday, Louisiana, and grew up in a small town. In a family full of music and religion, Jimmy's cousin Jerry Lee Lewis became a rock and roll legend, and another cousin, Mickey Gilley, became famous in country music. But Jimmy chose a different path. Preaching called to him from a young age, and he never gave up on it, even when things got hard. In 1952, when he was only 17, he married Frances Anderson, who was only 15. Their early years were hard because money was tight, and they often had to rely on churches for shelter. They lived on $30 a week, which is about $330 today. They stayed in church basements or the homes of pastors while Jimmy traveled to preach wherever he could. Life was hard, but Frances never gave up. She wasn't just Jimmy's wife, she was also a partner in his ministry. Over the years, Frances became the driving force behind Jimmy Swaggart Ministries. Today, she is the chief financial officer of the organization and is in charge of 255 employees. Her leadership has been instrumental in the ministry's survival. Jimmy once said she was so good at what she did that she could run a company as big as General Motors. But she did more than just help the company make money. She also became a well-known voice in Christian broadcasting by hosting Frances and Friends, a daily talk show on the Sun Life Broadcasting Network. On the show, she talks about social issues, politics, and biblical teachings, often touching on touchy issues that affect the modern church. She has also written books such as The Modern Babylon, 2006, and Aneris saw Donnie Swaggart, Jimmy Swaggart's son, has closely followed in his father's footsteps. As executive vice president of Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, he plays a key role in running the organization and preaching as co-pastor of the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge, where he delivers passionate sermons that focus heavily on Pentecostal beliefs and the role of the Holy Spirit. His style is intense and energetic, similar to his father's. Donnie has taken his message outside of church walls, speaking at evangelistic events across the U.S. and internationally. He is also a main speaker at the Ministries biannual camp meetings gatherings, which draw thousands of believers looking for spiritual renewal. The Swaggart legacy doesn't end with Donnie. His son Gabriel leads Crossfire Youth Ministry, an outreach program for young Christians, and another son Matthew helps out in a variety of ways. In a different way, working as a television graphics artist and photographer for the ministry shows how much the Swaggart family has built their lives around faith and evangelism. Even though the Swaggarts are very dedicated to the ministry, they have been in some trouble. Jimmy Swaggart's leadership style has been called both powerful and controlling. While he built one of the biggest televangelist empires of the 20th century, former employees have said he was authoritarian, and some say he demanded complete loyalty and had a tight grip on the ministry's finances and operations. The biggest blow to his reputation came in 1988. At that time, Swaggart was one of the most famous televangelists in America, and people all over the world watched his fiery sermons on TV. But in February of that year, he was caught in a prostitution scandal, which led to his suspension and downfall by the Assemblies of God. The scandal shocked the Christian world, not only for what he did, but also for what he preached. Just 2 years earlier, Swaggart helped bring to light the sexual misconduct of fellow televangelist Jim Bakker. He had publicly condemned Bakker's actions, portraying himself as a moral defender, but when his own sins were revealed, the hypocrisy was clear. The fallout was immediate. The Assemblies of God stripped him of his ministerial credentials, and many of his supporters stopped giving money to his TV empire, which used to bring in millions of dollars in donations, to fall apart. But Swaggart refused to stop preaching. In 1991, he was caught in another prostitution scandal, which hurt his already damaged reputation even more. Despite these public embarrassments, he never fully disappeared from the religious scene. To keep control of his ministry, Swaggart made a smart move. Instead of staying under the authority of a larger church body, he turned it into an independent, non-denominational organization. This gave him full control and allowed him to keep preaching. Critics say that preaching without outside control is only he became more authoritarian, but for Swaggart, it was a way to keep his vision alive. There have been financial questions about him throughout his career. At its peak, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries had a $11,500,000 payroll, and there were concerns about how the money was being managed. Claims of excessive spending went against the humble image he put on, and some people said he used donations for personal pleasure instead of ministry work. Despite controversies, he has kept the organization going, thanks in large part to the Sun Life Broadcasting Network's ability to attract viewers from all over the world. Even now, Jimmy Swaggart is still a controversial figure. To those who disagree with him, he represents the dangers of unchecked religious power. To those who support him, he is a symbol of strength as a preacher who fell but refused to stay down. No matter which side people take, one thing is certain. It's hard to ignore how much he changed modern televangelism.